in Scott Horton. Henry, you can respond to that later. Scott Horton, I mean, many things can be true at once. I don't disbelieve for a moment that what Henry is articulating is Vladimir Putin's view, and is probably a view held by many Russians. Nor do I dispute that John Sweeney, from his work on the ground in Ukraine, has his view and is equally sincerely held, as is General Clark's. In other words, you know, depending who you talk to, the view of this whole war is very different, isn't it?
Yeah, well, look, I should say that I agree with your first two guests in sentiment as far as my sympathies are with the people of Ukraine. I think this whole war has been an absolute catastrophe for everyone involved, including the United States, and for all of our foreign policies in the world we got to live in going forward from here. It's a disaster, but I believe General Clark and I agreed on your show last December that, in fact, the Russians are ascendant on the battlefield. If you look at the battle maps, you know, by the experts that show that the Russians are taking more and more territory all the time. And the problem for Donald Trump is that he just got inaugurated at the wrong time. So he's trying to call timeout when the Russians are winning, but their strategy, of course, is just to fight a war of attrition rather than just seize territory. So they have not yet succeeded in taking all of Donetsk, Zaporozhye, or Kherson, which they have claimed to have officially annexed since September of 22. And so what's happening is the Ukrainians are just losing more men and more lives as the thing goes on. And Putin essentially has no real reason to quit now. And the Americans really had nothing to offer him, even if Trump dropped all the sanctions and gave him full normalization and promised, put it in a treaty never to invite Ukraine into NATO or something like that. Well, Chelsea Clinton or somebody could become the president in a few years from now and go back on all that when, of course, the entire American establishment would be against it. And so it'd be pretty difficult for the Russians to rely on that. So I think they're going to just keep fighting, which is absolutely horrible. And, as I showed in the book, and it's been a few months, Piers, I don't know if you've had a chance to finish reading Provoked yet, but as I show in the book, even the most hawkish NATO expanders and the most prominent American grand strategists that you could possibly name of our era, Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, they both said, we have to come up with a special status for Ukraine. We have to make it like Austria in the Cold War so that it's neutral, so that it's a bridge between East and West. Because if we try to take it away, the Russians are going to invade and break the thing. Just the same as John Mearsheimer warned, just the same as Jeffrey Sachs warned back years ago, that it was American meddling that was forcing this issue. And that does not justify what Russia has done here. Again, the book is called Provoked, Not Justified. But the reality is that America, Washington, D.C., our government, got our Ukrainian friends into this mess. And unlike what the second guy said, Mr. Sweeney, that, this is going to end with Russia crushed, you have it right, Piers, that unless we're willing to send in the 82nd Airborne and the U.S. Navy, that we cannot reverse the tide for Ukraine here. So where does that leave us? And General Clark said last December on your show that, okay, yeah, but we shouldn't really talk like that and betray our position of weakness in any upcoming negotiations. Well, now it's the end of July, and they've done nothing but lose more men and more territory since then. So where are we really going with this?
Yeah, I mean, General Clark, historically, Russia has shown a remarkable patience when it comes to warfare. They will keep going and withstand losses that many other countries would simply not tolerate to achieve their aims. I'm not quite sure why, looking at the state of this war, why people would think that Russia are about to be crushed. I don't really see evidence of what John suggests there. And from a military perspective, unless America gets involved in a more direct manner, isn't the reality that Russia's military vastly outweighs Ukraine's and therefore is highly unlikely to lose?
I think it's, I think this is like saying, Piers, in 1942, when Germany was at its maximum penetration of the Soviet Union, that no one could see how it could possibly be turned around, that the 1,000-year Reich was going to be there. And you would have told Stalin, why don't you surrender? I mean, why lose all this territory? Why risk Moscow? Why don't you surrender? Look, the people of Ukraine understand very well what's at risk in this. They know that should Russia dominate and take this, there will be massive ethnic cleansing. There will be millions of people liquidated. There will be huge refugee flows to the West, and the rest of Western Europe will be destabilized in one way or another, and there are enormous consequences on China. So yes, all of the leaders of Western Europe and most of the United States wants Ukraine to prevail. And I'm not sanguine about the threatened 100% tariffs working on Russia. I think the answer is the United States fumbled early on in this by not giving Ukraine greater military assistance, by not appreciating the skill and the diligence and the courage of the Ukrainian warriors. And I think we'd be making a big mistake right now if we assumed that Ukraine cannot win. I believe Ukraine can win. And when you talk about Russia, don't talk about Russia. Russia is not some great public work democracy that wants to go one way or another. Russia is a small group of people at the top, dominated by Vladimir Putin and his intelligence organizations, that crushes Russia's opinion, that dominates, that bullies, threatens, imprisons, and murders its opponents. It's not a democracy. And under Putin, it's not a state that you can consider as a good actor to be brought back into the international community. And that's why nothing happened in January, because even with all of the goodwill that Donald Trump wanted to bring to Vladimir Putin, he and his people recognized you can't deal with this man. So the United States has not tried to destabilize Russia. Maybe we should have, but we didn't. But Putin's going to do a good enough job himself by continuing to draw off people, by exposing the Russian people to these casualties. Already, St. Petersburg, Moscow, people know what this is about. Given the slightest setback, Putin will be pushed aside, would be my expectation. So he's afraid to have a ceasefire. He's afraid to pull back on his objectives. He's afraid to let the Russian people know the truth about the sacrifices there. So let's not say Russia is don't look at this like there's Russia, there's Britain, there's France. No, there isn't. There's France, there's Britain, there's the United States, and then there's Putin. He
General,
more
you really think that Ukraine
than Hitler represented everybody in Germany.
You really think that Ukraine, sir, can drive the Russian army out of Luhansk and Donetsk, Zaporozhye and Kherson, and even Crimea to retake every last inch like in the promises? By what magic wish is this supposed to take place?
You know, Scott, I've been around the military for a long, long time. And I've been around some of the people in Ukraine for a long time. And I know that they know what the stakes are in this. They know what the risks are, and they're not about to give up. And when you have people who believe that fervently in what their future is, don't write them off, okay? And it's not in your place to be saying, oh, we don't think you can win. We know you want freedom. We know Putin's a bad guy, but we're going to give up on you. We're not going to give up on Ukraine if we can summon the will of the West. This is our civilization. Ukraine is fighting
General,
for. Just a second, Scott. Just a second. You give up on Ukraine. The next thing is the Baltics. And by the way, the Russians have already published video propaganda showing how Russians would parachute into Gotland, take Gotland, surround the Baltic states, demand that NATO move out and dare us to, and then threaten nuclear weapons. These plans are in the books. So look, I appreciate your sympathies. I know you're trying to find some area of agreement with me, but look, this is a battle that the West must face up to and face down Mr. Putin.
The thing is, you correctly deny that Russia is this single organism, but you talk about Ukraine as though it is, when in fact, we're talking about a conscript army. And according to the Associated Press and the New York Times, with hundreds of thousands of deserters, people in the hundreds at least drowning in the river trying to escape from Moldova, conscript press gangs kidnapping people off the streets. This is like Woodrow Wilson saying, oh, the people of America have volunteered en masse.
Well, here's the thing you
to
may not
fight
understand.
terrorists. It's not true.
If you look at what happened in Maidan last week, when President Zelensky said, I think we'll get rid of the Anti-Corruption Commission, there were tens of thousands of people out there.
Good point.
Ukraine will fight for its independence. It does. Look, and let's be clear about something else, Scott, and to all those who say, including our guest from Russia, the United States did not in 2014 demand that Ukraine come in to NATO. In fact, it had been dropped really since 2008. All the Ukrainians wanted was to be out from under the thumb of Russian corruption. That's why they wanted the association with the European Union. Look, Russia is a corrupt mafia intelligence-led state headed by Vladimir Putin. It's not the way you can deal in the modern world. So you just have to sort of pull up your socks and say, look, I know it's unreasonable. You can't believe a free country can mobilize its opinion and stand up against a juggernaut like the Red Army. Well, they've done it, and they're going to continue to do it. That's what my prediction is.
Okay.
Unless
But in your analogy, Hitler has nukes.
Pull out the support for Ukraine, and we can't.
In your analogy, General, Hitler has nukes, and Stalin has no choice but to surrender.
I'm not going to deal in analogies like that.
It would take the Western allies to
Ukraine.
intervene. It would take the Western allies to directly intervene, and we can't.
Scott, I know, for example, I actually, there's a friend of mine who's a Ukrainian soldier, Vladimchenko, who arrested me for being a Russian spy, rather comically, on day 2 of the big war. And I saw him very recently, and he's still fighting for Ukraine, as are all his friends. And he has, now let's be clear about this. In 2022, the Russians invade and they take a fifth of Ukraine, and they've got still a fifth, and they've got a little bit more, but not much more. So why aren't they in Kyiv? Why is the Ukrainian army fighting so strong? Why can you answer that question? Why has the Ukrainian army managed to stop the Russian army from taking the capital? Is it because they believe in what they're fighting for? Is it because they believe in liberty?
Sure.
And someone like you, sir, you're like Lord Haw, broadcasting as if you're from Nazi-occupied Berlin.
Come on. You're like George W. Bush saying we can't cut and run now or our boys will have died in vain, so we have to stay in the war. That's what you're like.
I don't know, but there are ordinary Ukrainian soldiers are fighting for their country and their idea of freedom.
Ordinary Iraqis were fighting with Americans for their faction against the other side.
No,
we can't leave
you're
now.
not listening to me. I mean, I
It's the
don't
same
know
thing.
whether there's a... Listen, mate,
It's the
I don't know
same
whether there's a KGB guy underneath your table holding your balls.
Oh,
or
give me a
something
break.
like
That's
this.
really all you got.
Oh, really? Oh, so I can tell you 4 Russian people I know who are critical of Vladimir Putin.
What percentage of the army are conscripts in Ukraine?
Natasha Esmerova, Boris Nemtsov, Alexei Navalny, all shot or poisoned, right?
Yeah.
Now, you cannot say this about the critics of Zelensky. The critics of Zelensky were out in the streets of Kiev in their tens of thousands.
A lot of critics of Zelensky have been charged with treason and kidnapping.
And use
and
of Kremlin, which is a dictatorship.
Yeah, a lot of dissidents in Ukraine
Okay.
have been rounded up and put in prison.
Let me give Henry a chance to respond. First of all, Henry,
Sure.
John Sweeney said you're a servant of the fascist state. What's your response to that?
I think it's getting too personal, and I don't think that's a serious question to answer, because if you want, I can describe you what fascism is, because I'm a specialist on Italy's history, so I can give you a very qualified answer what fascism is. And maybe the modern leftist liberal ideology is going to be the exact analogy of what fascism is. But believe me, Russia is, you're just using the Western approach towards trying to describe any nation in the world according only to the Western view on itself and on its own history. the world is not divided into three political regimes, which were described by the Western political philosophy. And then each time any country is analyzed, it's either liberal democracy or it's going to be authoritarian or totalitarian state, which is nonsense and doesn't describe the world in the whole variety of the different models which exist there. Also, I would like for
okay,
Mr.
but let me
Sweeney,
ask you a different question.
Can
All right, but
I
Henry,
just
let me
make
ask you a different question.
on the thing Mr. Sweeney told before, because you told me I can react.
Yeah.
Just one sentence, please. Mr. Sweeney, I guess you were a little bit emotional. That's why you made a historical mistake when speaking of Poland and its borders. If you don't like the borders of Poland, which were drawn by Stalin, it's going to be twice smaller because Poland in its actual borders were really drawn by Stalin, as well as the Baltic states, as well as all the post-Soviet Union states. They were drawn, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, by Stalin. Then the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc collapsed right exactly in the borders drawn by Stalin. So if you don't like Stalin's borders, it's going to be the borders of the Russian Empire, which are much bigger. I don't think you would like it more than the Stalin's one. So that's just my comment. Please, Piers, sorry.
Yeah, well, the question I was going to ask is that Russia, clearly, when they launched its, as he called it, a special operation, the rest of the world called it a war, invasion of a sovereign democratic European country. But when it did that in 3 years ago now, there was an expectation on the Russian side. It would steam into Kyiv and it would take control. Zelensky would go, they would overthrow the government and they would take charge. And that didn't happen. And here we are, 3 years later. Yes, Russia's a nuclear power. Yes, it has a massive military. Yes, the sanctions haven't really had much impact. In fact, Russia's economy has survived and actually thrived, you could argue, pretty successfully through all this. Which makes me think the tariffs may not work either. But it does beg the question, if Russia is so powerful and has right on its side, why is it struggling so badly to win this war?
Well, first of all, the difference between special military operation and war is the scale. The general is much more experienced than I am in this question. Maybe he would confirm this, but we didn't have mobilization in our country only once for 300,000 people. And then all of our military servants, they went for a voluntary contract. We didn't have obligatory mobilization in contrast to Ukraine. That's the first thing. Secondly, as you know, and General said it, and Mr. Sweeney said the same thing, that the Western countries and NATO are doing everything possible. They are supporting Ukraine as much as they can, etc., etc. You've given them almost everything you could, at least the European countries. As I know, you did everything possible and impossible to help them with your military aid, with your financial aid, with your instructors, with your intelligence, with everything. Everything possible and impossible was done to help Ukrainians fight Russians, as you know. So in reality, Russia, with its special military operation in the territory of Ukraine, we are facing the NATO instructors, we are facing NATO tactics, we are facing NATO weaponry, we are facing financing given by the Western countries. And each time we hear that even the Western leaders, they say that if we stop financing Ukraine for 1 week, the war is going to be over because Ukraine is going to collapse. That's why I think when you ask why Russia it takes so long for Russia to reach the objectives, you should understand that Russia at this moment is combating the full scale, the possibilities of NATO as a military union, although NATO officially doesn't involve in this country, but still we know that almost everything it could do, it's been done during these 3 years, or almost 4 years, for Ukraine. That's the second thing. Third thing, I want to stress it out that each time it is said that Russia was going to overthrow the political power in Ukraine in 3 days, and it was going to take only 3 days to take Kiev. That is the commentary which was made for tens of times by British political authorities. You can never find a single video when Russian political authority, I don't mean journalists or speakers or experts, but Russian political authorities never said it's going to take 3 days, 4 days, 1 week, 1 month, or 1 year. It was usually said by the British political authorities, which said that it will take Russian 3 days to take Kiev, and then on the 4th day, they said, okay, Russian military is not so strong enough to take it in